Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is John Carroll. I work at the University of Hong Kong, and it's my great pleasure today to reintroduce, I should say, our speaker, Professor Denise Ho from Yale University, which is also where she did her BA before going off to Harvard University to do her PhD. Now, Denise is no stranger to Hong Kong. Her parents are originally from Hong Kong. She previously taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She is also no stranger to heat and humidity, because after graduating from Yale, she taught English in Changsha, where today the temperature is supposed to get up to 36 degrees Celsius. So this is one of the few times you're probably grateful to be in a Hong Kong summer instead of up in Changsha. She also taught at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky, where the summers, I believe, are not always very pleasant. She is, however, a stranger to the Hong Kong Book Fair. This is her very first time here, so I'm doubly happy to welcome her to the Hong Kong Book Fair. Now, the title of her talk today, as you can see from the many flyers, placards around, is Culture in Revolution, the Shanghai Museum in Mao's Period and Beyond, and it draws from her recently published book, Curating Revolution, Politics on Display in Mao's China, which is published last autumn in 2017, again by Cambridge University Press. Now, this is a particularly interesting topic to me personally, partly because I've also done some works on museums in Hong Kong, and partly because I teach a course on museums at the University of Hong Kong. So I just want to say a few very, very brief words here about why museums matter. And I suppose in some ways I don't have to say much because you're all here, this is a great crowd, you all know why museums matter, but I just want to say one or two things as well. Museums are not neutral places where people go to get information, right? They never have been, and nobody has ever meant them to be that. Some people call them meeting grounds, right? Places where informal and formal versions of the past come together. Places where official and formal versions of the past meet, and they all sometimes collide with individual or collective versions of the past. You may also know that museums can be used for strategic purposes, right? Regulating social behavior. In fact, the history of the museum, as we know it, as it sort of evolved in early modern Europe, was to make people into good citizens, right? You didn't wear a t-shirt into a museum. You dressed properly and you were supposed to behave well. They're also used to build citizenship and national identity. And of course, they can be very controversial places, right? One of the best examples is the Enola Gay exhibit at the Smithsonian exhibition many years ago in the United States. But we also, I think most of us know that it's not just in the United States where museums are controversial, it's here in Hong Kong as well. And just to give you one example, we can think about the National Palace Museum controversy of the year before last, which of course in many ways is not really about museums at all, right, but about something else. That's all you have to hear from me, at least for right now. Please join me in re-welcoming Denise back to Hong Kong and back, well, not back to, but to her very first Hong Kong Book Fair. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Good, great. So I'd like to start by thanking the Hong Kong Book Fair and the Trade and Development Council for inviting me to talk about my book, and also thank you to John for hosting and moderating and saying a few words to introduce this concept of thinking about museums in history. So what I'd like to do as a way to start is to talk about how my book is structured. Since we don't have that much time today, I'm going to focus on a case study, so the case study of the Shanghai Museum. But I want to start by telling you how that chapter about the Shanghai Museum is situated within the larger book. So the book is called Curating Revolution, Politics on Display in Mao's China. And this is a history of politics, the politics of culture in the Mao years, from the establishment of the PRC in 1949 to Mao's death in 1976. Although what I try to do with the book is bring each chapter into the present and think about how the legacies of a particular kind of exhibition live on in China today. So the book studies the relationship between museums and exhibitions in the Mao era, and especially what they have to do with Mao era political campaigns. Some of the museums are well known and still exist in China today. Like, for example, on the left-hand side there you see the First Party Congress site where the Communist Party was founded. That's how the book starts, with a chapter on the First Party Congress site. And then the last chapter of the book is about the Shanghai Museum. So the former one is probably not one that tourists typically go to, but I'm sure that many first-time visitors to Shanghai have been to the latter. So let me just get a sense of the audience. A show of hands, how many of you have been to the Shanghai Museum? Okay, maybe about 20% of the crowd? All right. And here are some images of the Shanghai Museum in its various iterations over time. And in the middle, on the bottom there, you'll see the present-day Shanghai Museum. So let me walk through the other case studies and just tell you what the other chapters in the book are about before I turn to the Shanghai Museum. So they include an exhibit in a former shanty town called Fanghua Lane that was turned into a new workers' village. This was a display about the modernization of everyday life, and it would have been familiar to Shanghai school children alike, as well as foreign dignitaries. Edgar Snow, the person who wrote the famous biography of Mao, had also been to visit this site. I have a chapter on exhibitions about so-called superstition. So this is about education for children, grassroots propaganda displays. I have a chapter about socialist education exhibitions that went along with socialist education movement in the early 1960s, leading up to the Cultural Revolution. And then the fifth chapter is a chapter on exhibitions put on by Red Guards. So the things that they confiscated when they ransacked people's homes at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. These were items that were then put on display. So in my book, I argue that all of these case studies are part of what I call curating revolution. That is to say, using exhibitionary culture to both make and reflect revolution. And I can talk more about these individual case studies in Q&A if you're interested. So today I'm going to focus on the story of the Shanghai Museum, which is probably a story that's most familiar to this or any audience. And I actually wanted to start with the story of how I came to this research. So how many of you are students, undergraduate students or graduate students? Okay, also maybe about a fifth of the group. How many of you are students of history? Okay, all right, at least three. All right, so it may be interesting to you to know how I came to this topic. So it's actually archival materials that led me to this research. When I was a graduate student looking around for a topic, I was spending some time at the Shanghai Municipal Archive. And so I did a search for the word cultural relic, so looking for the word wanwu in the catalog. And what popped up were documents from the Shanghai Bureau of Culture from the early years of the Cultural Revolution. And this piqued my interest because when we think about the Cultural Revolution, right, we think about these kinds of images, the destruction of cultural objects. So then the question is, when you look at these archival documents, at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, what's happening in China's cultural bureaucracy? So let's zoom in on Shanghai. So we'll start with this image of the Longhua Pagoda in the southwestern corner of the city of Shanghai. You can still visit it today. It dates from the Song Dynasty. It's celebrated as one of Shanghai's famous sites to visit. And on August 23rd, 1966, as the Cultural Revolution unfolds in Shanghai, a group of Red Guards calling themselves the Burn the Pagoda headquarters looped ropes around the base of the pagoda. They're preparing to pull it down. And as they prepare to pull it down, a second ring forms around the pagoda. And this circle is made of people holding hands. So there's a rope around the pagoda. There's a circle of people around the pagoda holding hands. Someone called Zhong Yinlan, a young worker in the Shanghai Museum, remembers, and I quote, "We explained to the Red Guards that the pagoda was wanwu, a cultural relic, not one of the four olds, these things that are being attacked at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution." Other museum workers, college students, and local residents joined hands, shouting, "Do not burn, do not burn," and the Lunghua Pagoda stood. You've probably heard other stories like this. Despite the Cultural Revolution's attack on the Four Olds, so the Four Olds are old thinking, old culture, old customs, and old habits, there are many historic sites in China that were spared destruction. Often there is a local legend about the site, and often it involves Premier Zhou Enlai. And you've probably read something like this kind of story if you just open up any guidebook, like The Lonely Planet China. This temple, it was saved by Zhou Enlai. So with this example of the Shanghai Museum that I'm going to talk about today, I want to uncover the history. What's the history behind those legends? In the case of the Lunghua Pagoda, actually, a protective order was transmitted by Zhou Enlai the day of the attack. Then he shows up again in December of 1966 when he receives and thanks some of the students involved in saving the pagoda. But it turns out that there is a much more comprehensive institutional structure at work. So what I want to do today is bring us behind the scenes of the museum and think about how a museum works. So let's turn to the Shanghai Museum. So the institutions, and this is for the history students here, you know institutions are important, right? So there are two main institutions that make up the Shanghai cultural bureaucracy at this moment. The Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission and the Shanghai Museum. And together they're in charge of Shanghai's Wanwu, or cultural relics. The Shanghai Museum was established in 1952. It was first housed in the former racecourse building, and then it moved to an Art Deco bank building, and these images are from the latter location, dating to the 1960s. And these are some images that I found in the archive. I'd like to highlight two aspects of the behind-the-scenes work at the museum. John talked a little bit about the ways in which museums present a certain kind of history, the way they present themselves to visitors. And so as visitors ourselves to museums, we usually encounter the public face of the exhibition. But for the purposes of today's story, it's important to think about two other kinds of functions of the museum. One is collection, and the other is the training of staff, right? These are the kinds of important things that happen inside the museum. So let's start with collection, and I think we can think of the idea of curating. When I say curating revolution, collection is the first part of curating. Without collection, you don't have anything to display. So in 1952, when the Shanghai Museum was established, it had about 7,000 objects. Almost 3,000 of these items arrived in Shanghai in 2 trucks in May of 1949, carried from the battlefields on the behalf of General Chen Yi, who became Shanghai's mayor. But these items are largely symbolic. They aren't the finest items in the collection. There are 2 ways that a museum, or the Shanghai Museum, acquired new pieces: purchase and donation. In the case of purchase, during the early 1950s, the Shanghai Museum received fully 1/3 of the municipal budget allotted for culture and education, with Mayor Chen Yi himself intervening to approve purchases of art. Someone called Li Junjie, who joined the museum in 1952, remembers, quote, and this is from an interview, "We would bring out the good stuff and invite Leader Chen to have a look, and we would ask, should we buy it? He would respond, yes, let's buy it. And what if we didn't have enough money? He'd say, well, hurry up and write a report, and I'll approve it." So one of the things you have to remember about the 1950s is that one can still buy and sell antiquities on the open market until 1956, when Shanghai undergoes socialist transformation. And after that, you can only buy and sell with the state, or you can only sell to the state. So that's one way the museum acquires stuff, through purchase. The other way is to acquire new artwork through donation. By 1959, over 1,000 people and almost 200 organizations had donated a total of 70,000 wonwu to the museum. Another thing to remember is that Shanghai is historically the center of wealth and connoisseurship. And especially in the context of the Second World War, you remember that Shanghai has foreign concessions. So collectors fled to the relative safety of the foreign concessions and brought their artwork with them. These collectors could sell to the museum, and they could also donate, receiving in exchange not just money, which is usually a rather small, a token amount, but also political recognition and even benefits like university places, jobs, and housing. So in turn, it's the job of museum officials to know who the collectors are and know what they possess, and also to cultivate relationships with collectors. I think this is much the same as museum work works today. You have to know who has what. So we talked about collection. Next, I want to talk a little bit about training of staff. The young woman I quoted on the Longhua Pagoda, who was standing there holding hands with other people, joined the museum in 1952, having not finished middle school. We can think of the Shanghai Museum staff at that moment as having 3 generations. The first generation included artists, collectors, and museum staff from before 1949. There was a Shanghai Municipal Museum in the 1930s. They were the ones to create the 1952 exhibition. They're the ones to write the catalog. And they trained Zheng Yinlan's generation with lessons in art history, and art appraisal. Right? This new generation has to be trained. The second generation of the Shanghai Museum included a younger cohort of junior leaders who had joined the Communist Party underground as art workers. And finally, the youngest generation included Zheng Yinlan and others of this 1952 cohort and after. For her part, Zheng started her training as a docent, but because she had very beautiful handwriting, she was sent to work on the catalog. In 1959, she was selected to study painting for appraisal. And to do this, she had to study painting. The idea was, how do you actually know what a painting is about unless you can paint yourself? So every Monday morning, she went to the home of a painter and collector. And like a student in imperial times, she arrived before he had even woken up, cleaned the desk, prepared the water, and ground ink from a tablet. For the following 7 years, she painted every night on the one family table, and only after her brothers had finished their homework. She was made a full-fledged appraiser in 1966, the year the Cultural Revolution began. So we've talked about collection, we've talked about training as 2 behind-the-scenes aspects of museum work. So what actually happened at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution? So let's return to that moment of this attack on the 4 olds. And here you see a propaganda poster of a Red Guard smashing things that represent the 4 olds. There's a crucifix, a Buddha, classics, classic texts, a record, dice, I think, representing gambling. So, attacking the 4 olds. The moment this happens, the Shanghai Museum packed up its exhibition rooms and sealed its doors. We saw the moment of the protection of the Longhua Pagoda, right? You have this physical cultural relic. What about objects in private collections? The Shanghai Museum established a 24-hour hotline, and young workers of Zheng Yinlan's generation joined a rotation in which they slept by the phone. She remembers, quote, "If we heard that a certain household was going to be searched or that there were Red Guards going to attack the 4 olds in a house at midnight, we would send people as quickly as we could. At midnight or 1 or 2 in the morning, no matter what time, if there was a collection with paintings, I would go there at once. I never got to return home." Her account of the story of Liu Jingji, a former textile manufacturer and collector of paintings, is worth recounting at length. She says, "I arrived at his house and spent the entire night there from 6 p.m. to 11 the next morning. He had many paintings, about 2,000 and more. First he was struggled by the rebels. Then he was made to stand in his garden. He stood until the rebels left, and then he snuck back inside. Liu saw me writing out the inventory, and he came to stand next to me while I wrote out the numbers, one by one, identifying the paintings and the scrolls by name. This is so-and-so artist, this is such and such painting. He stood there for a long time, and finally he said, 'Miss, you seem to be a Wanwu's expert. You look at the painting, and you immediately know its name. What work unit are you from?' I responded, 'The Shanghai Museum. Our museum will protect them.' And immediately his spirits lifted, and he showed me other things. 'Take them away, take them all away. Don't leave a single thing behind.' In the post-Mao years, this story has been told and retold, becoming part of Shanghai Museum lore. Yet I think we can think of this as exceptional. Zhong Yinlan arrived in time, and Liu's collection was known, so they knew who the most famous collectors were. Many did not fare so well. So as I tell this story, and as I say that it's become a legend, I think it's important to also understand that this is not a representative story. What about other buildings? We've talked about the Longhua Pagoda. We've talked about the Shanghai Museum. I think the fate of Wanwu in Shanghai may better be represented by a report. And here I'm going back to the archival materials I pulled out as a graduate student. A report issued by the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission in October of 1966. This report told a very different tale, a tale of destruction. Most were not as fortunate as the Longhua Pagoda. All of the images of the gods in the city god temple were smashed. All of the Buddhas at the Chengshan Pavilion were destroyed. All of the Wanwu at the Jing'an Temple were lost. Thousands of volumes of scripture at Longhua Temple, right next door, were burned. The cross on Xujiahui Cathedral was torn down, and the interior of the cathedral was torched. Reporting on that destruction, the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission explained that some sites were so thoroughly destroyed, so completely destroyed, that it removed the Wanwu Protection Unit designation from the city's historic sites. So a site would be designated, this is protected by the city, so it actually took away the designation. But if you read that document between the lines, it looks like so between the lines of the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission bowing to the dictates of the attack on the Four Olds, you also see other kinds of salvage work at place. Some sites were deemed to have historical value, and the commission requested that they take photos, make surveys. So you have the sense that perhaps things might be rebuilt in the future. Surviving artifacts are to be sent to local museums. And finally, the commission stressed that if there was going to be any construction or agricultural development on historic sites in the future, it retained the right to coordinate excavation. So it's not an entire retreat from this mission of historic preservation. So I think both of these examples of the Shanghai Museum and the Shanghai Cultural Relics Commission suggest that there's a larger and more systematic mechanism to protect antiquity at the height of revolution. And this is an image of Shanghai Museum staff in the beginning of 1967. One question you might ask at this point is, if I'm suggesting that there's a system to protect cultural objects, how big is it? How comprehensive is it? Or if you're a student of Chinese history and politics, you might ask, how much of this is from the locality and how much of it is from the center? How much of this is coming from Beijing? How much of this is the initiative of local actors? And here, the answer is more complicated than just, this was an order from Zhou Enlai. So, December 1966, Qi Banyu, a junior member of the Central Cultural Revolution Group, which is this parapolitical group in charge of directing the Cultural Revolution, he goes to Beijing's Palace Museum to deliver a speech. In it, he makes the argument for a quote-unquote revolutionary palace museum, in which Wanwu would be protected as the people's property and used to raise their class consciousness. 2 months later, at the end of February 1967, Qi has a second meeting with cultural workers from Beijing's libraries, bookstores, Wanwu protection units, museums, and paper mills. Alarmed to learn that Beijing residents were destroying their own collections and that institutions that might have bought rare books before were too afraid to intervene, Qi declared, quote, "You should write a petition. The proletariat needs to carry out struggle with such things. You also need to keep these things as objects of criticism." So the argument was, you can't, if you destroy these things, you can't criticize them. So therefore, you must save them. All cultural workers, according to this meeting with Qi, had to adhere to the following principles: separate out books, protect and manage Wanwu, and do not destroy. it wasn't until Ji Benyu published his memoirs in 2016 that I got to trace a little bit more about what happened, because we have records of this meeting and we have records of the petition. But in his memoirs, he writes that he convened this meeting on Mao's orders, that Mao was happy to have read reports about it, and that Mao approved both of his speech and the measures that he recommended. That is, if we take Xi at his word. Beijing cultural workers did indeed circulate such a petition. But it's interesting, because I think when we think about Chinese history or Chinese politics, we think about things being from the top down or bottom up. And here I think we see a combination of both, right? You have top-down meetings, and then you also have bottom-up actions, as you saw in Shanghai earlier. If you just read this petition, it looks like it's bottom-up. There are all of these rebel groups from work units in Beijing writing this petition. But it's backed up by central power, right? You've gotten permission to do all of this. And on the same day that this petition came out, in the middle of February, the Chinese Academy of Sciences ordered the Shanghai Bureau of Culture to give a report about Wanwu in the city. A few days later, the Central Cultural Revolution Group directed the Ministry of Culture and the State Bureau of Cultural Relics to protect objects from being melted down to make scrap metal. And in the following months, the Central Committee, the State Council, and the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee all issued orders along similar lines. So you really have an intersection of central power and local initiative. In February, Zheng Yinlan went to work in the shell of Shanghai's Jujiahui Cathedral, a new institution called the Shanghai Municipal Small Group for sorting confiscated cultural relics and books. We'll call them this Wanwu Small Group, was established in April. It eventually consisted of over 100 workers and 12 different work units. By September, the Wanwu Small Group reported that it had received almost 300,000 objects and almost 400,000 volumes of rare books, not including items that had been salvaged from scrap paper mills or scrap metal plants. It compiled an index with photographs of the most valuable treasures, Shang and Zhou bronzes, ceramics from Song to Qing, books, seals, currency, and handicrafts. In a report from October, the Wanwu Small Group justified its work in two ways. It used Mao's writings, citing remarks from 1938, quote, "Today's China is an outgrowth of historic China. We are Marxist historicists. We must not mutilate history. From Confucius to Sun Yat-sen, we must sum it up critically, and we must constitute ourselves the heirs to this precious legacy." Another thing that the reports did was to glorify Red Guard house searches as cultural preservation from the masses. And here I'm also quoting from the report. In the course of the historically unprecedented Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, the little generals of the Red Guards and the revolutionary masses have confiscated numerous precious Wanwuan books, which are the creation of the motherland's historical laboring masses. This is an immortal contribution established by the Red Guards. This is a great victory for Mao Zedong thought. So the Wanwu Small Group continued to work throughout the Cultural Revolution. Between June 1967 and December of 1968, received over 3 million Wanwu and handicrafts and almost 6 million volumes of books. Here's a photo of the staff of the Shanghai Museum in the fall of 1967, and Zheng Yinlan is actually there underneath the vertical banner and the characters for Geming, for revolution. I want to talk about how we interpret these events, and especially how these events get mixed up in the documents. The Wanwu Small Group's reports, so if you just look at that institution's reports, it makes it sound like the work of rescue and salvage in 1966 and the work of collecting and sorting from 1967 were all part of the same thing. They're all part of the Red Guard movement, and that's what they intended to do. They're part of the Cultural Revolution all along. But I think you always have to be skeptical of people saying, well, that's what we meant to do, right? But I think those two moments, 66 and 67, should be seen separately. In fall of 1966, Zheng Yinlan and her colleagues were intercepting Red Guard attacks to prevent historic sites and private collections from being destroyed. In the case of the latter, records were made on the spot. Zheng would be dispatched as part of a team of 3. There's an art appraiser, a worker to box up the object, and there's also a scribe to make an inventory and issue a receipt. So there's a moment of salvage of the most famous collections. Then in 1967, I think the work of the Wanwu small group changes. It's to collect and sort through thousands of objects that are confiscated in a much more chaotic moment. And many of these objects then, there's no provenance. You don't know where they came from. So I think these moments should be thought of as distinct. It's a different kind of project, even though they're talked about as if they're the same thing. You might ask, what's the staff of the Wanwu small group? What are they sorting for? Part of their job is to figure out what is Wanwu, or an art object dating from the period of the Qianlong Emperor and earlier, or a handicraft, what's Gongyiping, which was to be funneled through state-run export companies and sold for foreign currency. This is a moment when China needs to have foreign exchange. So in this case, the rescue is to choose which objects should remain in China. And incidentally, Zheng Yinlan and her colleagues petitioned the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee, saying that this distinction was not scientific. How can you say that something is Wanwu and then the other is handicraft? And having the approval of the Shanghai Revolutionary Committee, she then went back into these export warehouses and brought back about 60,000 objects. How do we interpret, then, this kind of action, this kind of activity? I think you could make 2 arguments, and I'd be interested to see whether you think they're contradictory. I think they can actually be brought together. One argument is that this is exactly what the Red Guards claimed. It's the confiscation of Wanwu and books to be returned to the working masses, or to the state, as they represent the working masses. Di Yinlu's study of the Shanghai Museum demonstrates that within the 15 days of the attack on the Four Olds, the Shanghai Museum inventoried over 6,000 objects, of which 38 were top-tier Wanwu, the most precious objects, more than any single preceding year. Her research also shows that between 66 and 69, the Shanghai Museum acquired over 100,000 objects, increasing its collection by 71%. So in this interpretation, the Shanghai Museum is actually quite a lot like the Revolutionary Louvre Museum, in which works of art, so we don't often think about the Louvre as established during the French Revolution, but in the same way, art was also returned to their rightful owners, in scare quotes, or returned to the people. The sale of handicrafts overseas is also not unlike the sale of artwork by the Soviet Union, whose museum department of the People's Commissariat of Enlightenment used to provide gold for industrialization. So artwork for gold for industrialization in the Soviet Union. Preservationist appeals to historical tradition are not limited to a revolutionary context. In Vichy France, collaborators argued for French patrimony to retain artwork confiscated from Jewish collectors. And in fact, a historian has made an argument that we have the French museum system because of the Vichy regime. So that's one argument, that this is confiscation of objects for the state or for the people. I think there's a second, more nuanced argument to be made. The Shanghai Museum and the Wanwu Small Group did issue receipts when staff were on hand at the moment of confiscation. In 1984, Shanghai local officials were charged with returning Wanwu to their original owners. And the Wanwu Small Group estimated that among those items accounted for in 1986. So if there was a record of that item in 1986, 76% of Wanwu found their way back to their former owners. This was the case of the Mr. Liu with the painting, the huge painting collection, who was so overjoyed to see his collection that he made a donation to the Shanghai Museum. But of course, many objects were never accounted for. Some are destroyed outright during the attack on the Four Olds. Some made their way to the Wonwu small group stations without any indication of who they belonged to. And some that were inventoried in 1967-68 had disappeared by 1986. And of that category, the state made monetary restitution for almost 2 million items. So we have those two interpretations, confiscation, some attempt to find owners. We might also ask what historical actors thought they were doing. In oral histories, Zhong Yinlan is adamant that objects were being taken care of on behalf of the collectors. Those items that she went to box up during the attack on the Four Olds, she says they're daiguan, right? They're being taken care of on behalf of those individuals. She describes with pride her years in the countryside sorting Wonwu. Quote, "We had a very high consciousness. We didn't pay any mind to our living conditions. If one day a painting from the Qing dynasty would suddenly leap out at us, or a painting from the Ming dynasty, we were overjoyed. What a wonderful thing. For Wonwu to be protected with our own hands, this was a thing of great meaning, which made us very happy." Another one of Zhong Yinlan's contemporaries, who was dispatched by the state-run antiquities market to work for the Wonwu small group, remembered, quote, "Other people could go and study, or other people could go and rebel. Other people could go write big character posters. I would go and study our ancient culture and art. There were so many things that one had never seen before, and now one could see them, so it made one's heart rejoice." Perhaps then the irony is that even though the Cultural Revolution rhetoric was eventually repudiated, collecting antiquities was for the masses after all. First to cultivate this generation that came of age in New China, and I think we could argue that that group from the 1950s saw much more and were trained in a very particular way, something that no one else will ever experience. So first to cultivate this generation that comes of age in New China, and then to be curated for the public in the post-Mao era of reform. I'd like to conclude with a few implications. What are the implications of this story of the Shanghai Museum in the Cultural Revolution? In the book, I suggest that the Mao period saw the establishment of socialist museums and new exhibitions. The Shanghai Museum is an example of the former. The exhibitionary culture of a state in power, a state protecting or projecting its political legitimacy. Ma Chengyuan, a Shanghai Museum director who led the response to the attack on the Four Olds and returned to lead the museum during the era of reform and opening up, said that liberation brought a blank sheet of paper and an opportunity to establish a new style socialist museum. And yet I think this institutional history of the Shanghai Museum suggests that this blank sheet of paper, just like the legends that everything is because of Zhou Enlai, is more complex. For the workers of the Shanghai Museum, trained by artists and collectors from the old society, China's antiquity was always part of a revolutionary narrative. Contrary to iconic images of iconoclasm, like the propaganda posters or like the woodcut that I showed you earlier, Mao's 1940 essay on New Democracy provided a raison d'être. Without historic continuity, there would be no new culture. In her recent book on the mining town of Anyuan, Elizabeth Perry has argued that cultural nationalism has always been a cornerstone and touchstone of Chinese communism. In our own times, with the current Xi Jinping regime using both historical narratives and revolutionary narratives, I think it's helpful to understand that these stories of antiquity and revolution have always been intertwined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Denise. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the volume on? Excellent, excellent. This is meant to be a seminar, so we want to hear as much from you as possible, but being a selfish professor that I am, I have to ask the first question, if you don't mind. And that is that you've got some fascinating stories in here, and you tell them all so well. And what I'm thinking about here is in terms of writing the book. Was there a moment when you found a document, you met a person, at one point you suddenly said, this is a good story, and this is what I want to do? By the way, when you do a book that, it takes many years. When you do a PhD thesis, it makes many years. So when you make that decision, you're stuck with it in some ways. When did you decide this was a good story and it was worth sticking with? This is for those of you who are doing your postgraduate theses, those of you in the audience.
That's a great question. And also, I think it's helpful for the graduate students working on their thesis. I think the moment when I was curious about the story was when I got those flyers. So I won't scroll back to it, but the petition letters, right? So one of the things that we do when we study the history of the People's Republic is to sometimes look at things that people have thrown away. So flyers, letters, things that we call ephemera. So they're not collected in archives, they're not necessarily collected in libraries. And so it was a professor, Jin Dalu Laoshi, at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, who showed me some of these petitions or wall posters from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. I thought, oh, what is this story? I don't know what it is. But the real answer to your question, I think, is when I first was able to interview some people involved, because I think that's really when it seemed like a real story for me. Because when you look at texts, and if you're sitting in a library, you don't get the sense of this really being a living story. And so one of the things that I envy about some of the social scientific disciplines like anthropology and sociology is this opportunity to talk to people.
So speaking of stories, how does the museum today tell its own story, its own history? Does it in many ways? And by the way, one of the things I noticed and I do this whenever I go to a museum, because I do teach courses on museums, I always look to see who gives money. And I was surprised when I was last in the Shanghai Museum, which was in 2010, around the time of the expo, how many big people from Hong Kong have given money. And that's a very different question. But how does the museum tell its own history today? Does it deal, for example, with this period?
That's a good question. So there are things that we might think of as official histories, such as there's a tradition of writing gazetteers in China. So we usually think of these as county gazetteers or city gazetteers or gazetteers about particular industries. And in Shanghai, there is a gazetteer about cultural relics work. But I don't think this kind of story is told, or the way I tell it is not told on the museum walls. You might have stories of collectors, like if there is the story of this is the collection of so-and-so. And those are more celebratory of this collector and his taste.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's open things up. If I'm sure people have questions, maybe even comments. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, maybe raise your hand and one of us will run a microphone over to you. Questions, comments, suggestions?
Other kinds of sharing?
Yes, other sharing. If you've been to the museum and you've had something you want to talk about.
I went to the Shanghai Museum for twice times, and I looked at that. There's not much the mass propaganda poster as you saw us today. Do you think the mainland China government want to hidden up this piece of history?
That's a good question. So the question is, you don't see this kind of history or you don't see this kind of propaganda in the Shanghai Museum today. No, you're right. You don't really see that much of the history of the museum itself. But I think I don't know if that, I wouldn't say that it's about covering something up, because I think that the museum presents itself, it's an art museum. So it's presenting the art. So the narratives that you'll see on the walls will be about the narrative of, this is the development of bronzes, this is the development of paintings, this is the development of ceramics. And similarly, I think if you were to go to a museum, let's say if you went to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, you also would not have that much about the history of the museum itself. You would have the history of the art that's within it. So I agree with you that this story is not in the museum, but I think also the museum would not think that it's its primary purpose. Great question.
Can I just add one thing quickly, sort of in a similar vein to the question you asked? Some people have pointed out that the Hong Kong Museum of Art rarely ever has sort of controversial Hong Kong political art, such as the comics by Junji and people like that. So instead that they have a very different, they have sort of an orthodox view of the kind of art that they want to present. I don't know if it's similar, but.
Oh, can I just add something onto that? I think that museums can take that more political stance. I've never been to the Acropolis Museum, but my understanding is that there are empty rooms waiting for things to come back. So I think that museums can integrate that part of their history. They can integrate their history into their display if they so choose.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I've heard other historians commented that sometimes it's hard to access the central government's archives. So a lot of historians have to rely on archives from the local government. I wonder, what are your experiences with the central government's archive, and do you think that would change your story? And what are your suggestions to researchers?
That's a wonderful question. So the question is, what kind of story might be in the central government archives? I think Chinese citizens would have difficulty having access to central archives or party archives. And so I am many circles outside of that. So I don't have access to central documents. I will say that these are materials that I found in the Shanghai Municipal Archive, which has been more open than many other archives in China. And in this case, it would have been wonderful to see materials from the Shanghai Museum itself, for example, but I was not able to have access to that. I was only able to see things that were in the municipal archive that happened to be copied that involved the Bureau of Culture, for example. So B172 is the numbers that of files that belong to the Bureau of Culture, and those are the materials I was able to see. So I think there are many more stories to be written, but I don't think they can be written right now.
Hi. What's the perception now of revolution among the museums? I mean, it used to be revolution was glorified. May 4th movement was glorified. What's the perception now and how they're displaying exhibits? Is there a concern that maybe revolution shouldn't be glorified, that maybe there should be more gradual change instead of revolution? What's the current trend?
That's a great question. So may I ask for a clarification? It's not in the Shanghai Museum, but any kind of museology. Okay, so the bigger question is about how is revolution portrayed? I think one way to think about this is to think about the revolution, maybe capital R revolution, or a long century of revolution in China, which doesn't just include the communist revolution, of course, but the earlier revolution. I think you can think about them in different parts. And I think that the pre-49 part of the revolution has always been a safer part of the revolution to exhibit. So for example, in my book, I have a chapter about the first Party Congress site, so where the party was founded in 1921. And in some ways, those museum officials or those curators were lucky because they were curating the revolution and the establishment of the party at the moment of its founding. And interestingly, a museum about the revolution following the Soviet model is actually supposed to be something that people add on to over time, because you're still in revolution, right, after 49. And one of the things that museum officials wrote about in the early 1950s was that you're going to keep adding on to this museum. If you have a museum to the revolution, you're going to keep adding to it. You're going to add rooms. You're going to add parts of the display. But then, of course, coming to the late 1950s, you begin to have more controversial parts of the consequences of revolution, like the famine that follows the Great Leap Forward. The Cultural Revolution is also something that is controversial. And so these plans for this part of the exhibition get put off. People continue to collect, interestingly. And that's actually what's happening in the first photograph of the Shanghai Museum staff. There was a placard behind them that said the Shanghai People's Commune. As the Shanghai Museum, they were responsible for collecting contemporary objects. So they collected that as part of Cultural Revolution curating. But I think the actual display of those things was much harder. So we think about, in China today, many events, many controversial or politically sensitive events of the Maoist period are elided. But they were also elided during the Mao period itself, even when people continued to collect the objects.
We've got a lot of questions from this side of the room, so we need some questions from this side.
There's some hands from this side.
Ah, excellent.
Thank you, Ms. Ho. I basically have two questions.
Sure.
So I don't know what's this Shanghai Museum for. Is it for the party or for the audience? How do they record the audience? How many people visit the museum per day, something? Or just for the party's education or some kind of propaganda itself? And the second question is it easier to write in English for this consensus ideas than in Chinese? I don't know. There are many Chinese overseas scholars try to write Cultural Revolution or other items Mao's in English than in Chinese. It's easier, I think. I don't know. What's your view on this?
Great. Thanks for the question. So the first question is, what is the Shanghai Museum for? Or who is the Shanghai Museum for? From the beginning, it was meant to be an educational tool. So you had, let me back up. We think of it as, if you visit today, it's purely an art museum. But when if you were to visit, let's say, in the early 1960s, it actually had not just art, but it also had revolutionary history, and it also had propaganda for political campaigns. So it was a much more multifaceted, multi-sided museum in those times. And they did have special instructions for how you talk to children, how do you talk to older students, how do you make this material relevant to workers? So if you have workers who work in textile mills, how do you show them China's tradition of making textiles, making fabric or cotton or silk, so that they will feel proud about their heritage? So I think in theory it's supposed to be for everyone. But your question about whether it's for the party itself is a good one, because at this time, in the Maoist period, you can't just walk up to a museum and go in. it's organized. You have to go with a group, even to visit a propaganda exhibition. Well, that's not entirely true. But most of the time, you go with a group. It's your work unit that goes. So a place like the First Party Congress site, where the party was founded, the people who are going to that are mostly officials and foreign friends from other socialist countries or from left labor organizations from other countries. And it's not until the Cultural Revolution that you have more widespread visiting of the First Party Congress site. So the answer to your first question is it's complicated. Your second question, whether it's easier to write in English, or whether it's easier for foreign scholars to write in English about the Cultural Revolution. And by that, I think you mean, is it easier to publish in English?
Less political or less consensus.
Is that that's a good question. I think there are excellent scholars all over the world working on the Cultural Revolution. I think that senior colleagues in China face much more difficulty, both writing and publishing. And so actually, this is connected to Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Book Fair, because for many of our Chinese colleagues, their choice is to publish in Hong Kong or Taiwan, or to publish in English translation overseas. And so for those topics, actually, some of the big presses like Chinese University Press and Hong Kong U Press have done very important work in that way. Even not just doing traditional character versions, but also simplified character versions so that people in China can read them.
Also, just add something about museums. Who are museums for? It's not just a question in China, right? This is a question everywhere. Why do you have museums? Who do they benefit? And if you want to give an example, one would be in Hong Kong. Why is the history of so many museums in Hong Kong, why does it begin in the early 1970s? A lot of it has to do with the fact that we had the 1967 riots in Hong Kong, and the colonial government decided, partly in pressure to local people, that it needed to step in to help to do cultural things and to give them back to the people, right? As a way both to keep people out of trouble, but to show that we are your government, right? We had a little problem in 1967, but now we're going to take care of things, right? So I don't think it's just a question of a communist government necessarily.
Well, I have several questions to ask. My first question is about oral history, when you mentioned before, because when we are talking about your oral history as you were writing your book and you were using oral history as some kind of resources of your book, so how do you do the fact check of this oral story? Can you give us some example for it? And here comes my second question. When I'm listening to your seminar, I'm having a deja vu, some type of deja vu, because I've just read a book written by Andrea S. Goldman, The Opera in the City, in which it was talking about the opera, the Beijing opera, the type of Kunqi opera, Xipi Bangzi, the type of the traditional operas, traditional drama of China, and its relationship between the opera and the politic of culture in Beijing. So when I'm thinking about this topic, and it gives me a deja vu of it. So how do you think of the type of perspective to see this type of narrative, this type of history, through a very, very relatively small spot into a big history? And my third
Could I
question.
suggest that you do the two first, and then let's see if other people have questions, and then we'll come back to you, just to make sure everybody has a chance.
This is my last question.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry.
Okay, all right.
Well, because I'm a senior high school student in mainland China, so here comes a question I'm interested in, because recently my personal experience gave me a thought that the so-called history nihilism is type of popular or influential in my peer. The type of students in mainland China, they're now they don't like history because they don't want to talk about, they're busy about getting information about their idols, about their games. But if they want to talk about history, they were just oh, that's boring. Here the history book is so boring. And as your previous answer, in which the last commentator was asked that when we are going to the conferences, when we're going to the red education, and you always go in groups, that's right for us. So when they're going to it, it's type of harsh environment, and for them, it's type of comment that they don't want to ask. So what do you think of the so-called history nihilism and its relationship to our peer in mainland China? Thank you. It might be a bit complicated. I'm so sorry.
Those are fantastic questions, and I'm delighted that you are a senior high school student coming all the way to Hong Kong for a book fair. So it must mean that you don't believe in historical nihilism. Let's go kind of backwards with your questions. The point that you made about high school students not being so interested in history, I think, is not unique to China. I think that in America, at least growing up, growing up in the States, I think that high school history seemed a lot like names and dates. And I think that if it's names plus dates plus very politicized, it probably is not that interesting. I was in the Hong Kong Central Library last week looking at the Education Bureau. They published the old exams. And also what the right answers were. So they have the exam questions and what the correct answer is, and then what Hong Kong students replied, what their misunderstandings were, what percentage of them chose this question. And I was looking at these papers so that I could better understand what Hong Kong students learn about in high school history. And I have to say that the topic of those exams was not very interesting.
It's getting better.
And it was the same exam. You read it a couple of years in a row, the same questions. I know. So I think that especially if you're forced to take an exam, and it's so prescribed, then of course you may not be that interested. So I guess what I would hope is that if your classmates are interested in history, or you might ask them to talk to their parents or their grandparents about history, and maybe learning about their family's experience or their personal experience will give them a different view. So that was the third question. The first question about oral history and fact-checking, that's really difficult. I think it's important to have both kind of go back and forth between oral history and official documents, and then also published works, because a third piece of it is that there was earlier a question about archives in China. There may be other people who are writing books in China who have access to those archives that you don't. So you can also use their work. So I think it's not just oral history plus official history, but kind of triangulating different things. So it's not perfect. You should have a good framework when you go in to do an interview. You can maybe if you have some documents with you, you can check with them. So I think it's a matter of going back and forth and trying to do the best that you can. But certainly, memory is not always reliable, and people sometimes remember what they want to remember. Your second question about Andrea Goldman's book, I'm afraid I haven't read it, but my assumption is it's about the continuities of Beijing opera or kunqu over time. Am I correct?
And its relation to artistic culture.
Okay. So you can be the expert on the book, but I think that this is part of a number of works that show how traditional Chinese culture, if we can say the word traditional, has been preserved in a number of settings, whether it's connoisseurship and collecting. Some of the people who were buying objects sometimes after 1956-57 were party cadres who wanted to collect things. So there are elements of art appreciation that persist, music that persists, poetry, literature. I think this example can show that this is much more widespread than just one case study. So thanks for those great questions, and I hope you study history.
We had another hand over here.
Hi, I'm from Taiwan, so I had history when I was in high school. So only now I'm aging and I'm, have this interest, and I'm living in Hong Kong, so I begin to have more interest in Chinese history, especially after 1949, because everything we receive in Taiwan after 1949 obviously is totally biased towards KMT. Everything Mao Zedong did is bad, 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 bad. So I have no knowledge that such unit exists that to save the cultural relic during the Cultural Revolution, because all we know that Red Guard, they just destroy everything because of the 4-0s and et cetera, et cetera. So this unit in Shanghai Museum, is it only in this particular museum, or is systematically in different part of China? They have such organization, maybe, I don't know, appointed by Zhou Enlai or whoever higher power there to, to review this relic that collected by Red Guard and preserve it, or Red Guard just, destroy everything they consider old?
That's a great question, and I think the answer to that question is in the Central Archives, or in, let's say, the Ministry of Culture, because in the spring of '67 they're asking for reports from all of the localities. So I've been able to trace, I think Guangzhou was doing this, Nanjing was doing this, Beijing was doing this, but I don't have reports from those places. I just have a mention of those, let's say, in the Beijing Gazetteer, for example, about cultural relics. So I think this is one thing where if you had access to that kind of data, it would be in a central ministry or central archives, and someone once told me it would be really interesting if you could do a map, like if you could do historical geographic information systems and see what was done where. I do see in the Shanghai archives that Shanghai is aware of what Beijing is doing. So they'll say, oh, Beijing has this many people, so we should have this many people. So there is a sense of that. But I have a feeling that Shanghai is not representative because it's so big. There are a lot of wealthy people, and there are a lot of collectors. So I have a feeling that it's exceptional. It's in gazetteers. It's in collections of histories of various institutions in Shanghai history. I think that at the time there were rumors. Well, I think that I think some parts of society would have known because there were different collection stations. So there are different institutions that search people's houses or confiscate things from people's houses. So work units can search people's houses, Red Guards can search people's houses, random people can search people's houses. And so I think there was a knowledge that there were stations to turn things into. There's also some evidence of this in memoirs. So there's a book called Life and Death in Shanghai, which I think is one of the earliest memoirs of the Cultural Revolution. And in that, the author says that she heard rumors that there was this preservation effort, and she had some objects in her collection, but she wasn't like one of these famous connoisseurs, so no one came to her house to save her objects.
So I have two questions.
Sure.
First being, I think you mentioned that at the beginning, the Shanghai Museum, aside from being an art museum, also had artifacts or also had a focus on perhaps the revolution. So the first question is, why did the museum eventually, I guess, from the impression I get is that why did it kind of narrow down to being just art museum, and I guess why did its focus shift away from revolution? And the second question is, you mentioned, I think the state or the museum giving back some of the relics back to the people, and like 76% or something, as you mentioned, in 1984-6. What was the reasoning to, I guess, what were the motivations for them to do that? I mean, they could have just kind of kept it for themselves for like whatever value to study it or something. And what sort of effect did giving the relics back have on the state, I guess, and the people?
Great, thank you. Those are two excellent questions. The first question is, I had said that the Shanghai Museum had a much bigger purview during the Mao years. Why did it just focus on art? I actually don't know when the turning point was. At the very end of the Cultural Revolution, you begin to see exhibits that show up that are purely about art, but actually have a political slant, right? Like, here's an exhibition about bronzes, and the title of the exhibition is something like "Slaves Created History." So there is I don't know exactly what the transition point is, but there's a moment when this art, is still presented according to very Marxist class categories. I do think that one way to explain the transition is to think about art museums as part of the cultural diplomacy of reform and opening up. So in the same way, the Palace Museum officials are ordered to begin to prepare the museum. I believe both Kissinger and Nixon go to the Palace Museum. So a year before these visits happen, they're preparing the museum. You have, in the early 80s, the Shanghai Museum sends exhibits to Japan. And so I think that museums as showcases of art become this tool of reform-era cultural diplomacy. So I don't know when the exact moment is, but I think I would connect it to that role. Your second question is about giving back objects. Why would people get objects back? Or why would the state give objects back? I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that after the Cultural Revolution ends, there's this moment of redressing wrongful cases, right? Someone has been wrongfully labeled as a rightist or wrongfully labeled as a class enemy or whatever. And so as their case is redressed, then those things, not just art objects, but other forms of property are also to be returned. if they had gold and silver that was confiscated, if they had private property. This is really very controversial. But technically those things, if the case is redressed, they should be returned. So I think it's part of that larger sweep of rectification of names. So I think it's part of a legal procedure, or maybe I don't know what to call it, kind of a truth and reconciliation moment in China. There's a professor in Germany called Daniel Leza who's working on this post-Cultural Revolution moment and return of property. So I think that is why. But of course, for many people, they don't get their things back, or their things were destroyed, or their things were lost. And they're unhappy because not only are these things lost, but it's the state that decides how much this object was worth. Like, oh, you had this thing. It was worth 100 RMB, and the person might say it was worth far more than that, but the state has decided how much that's worth. Or they had gold confiscated from them. The state will tell them what the amount was. This is a very kind of controversial type of negotiation. Do you want to add anything to the museums being just about art? Okay. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you for your talk. That was fascinating. My question is about Zhou Enlai. So I know that your account is sort of decentering him as the great man of history, right? But I'm wondering if you're providing balance against, saying like mid-level officials and low-level officials are also very important, or are you totally replacing him? Is Zhou Enlai just like not important at all? Or, could you talk about a little bit more about what you see his role is after having done all this research?
I think I'm not trying to say that he had no role. I think I'm just setting it up as, if you've heard about preservation during the Cultural Revolution, it's probably because of Zhou Enlai as a kind of cultural hero. And I think that what I try to do with this interplay of central and local is to show that you really need to have both, right? The Shanghai people will say, oh, well, Shanghai is the most Wenming place in China, and so of course we preserve our cultural relics, but I think that all of these things need a kind of political space or a kind of political signaling. So it's when you have signaling at the top that allows people more space to do their work on the ground. And another thing I'd like to say about the local level officials is that they see this as their job, right, to protect these objects of antiquity. So there's also an element of professional pride or professional responsibility that's part of the work. So the quick answer to your question is, I'm not trying to discredit Zhou Enlai. I'm trying to say that it's much more complicated than that. And when we think about China, it's a big bureaucratic system. And it's fascinating to see how a bureaucratic system persists or is created in a moment what we think of as being totally chaotic.
Hello, Denise. Thank you for your topics.
Thank you for coming.
Seminar today. Just want to know what's your further research or your future topics. Would it be possible to interview those people in China's Cultural Revolution? Why I ask this, because I think they may be at their senior age. Mm-hmm. Some people pass away, or they are very old. So it's quite, it's the high time to maybe reach those old people to ask what they look back to China's Cultural Revolution. Also may reach to the victims who suffered, or also maybe people who that time prosecuted to the innocents. Mm-hmm. As what's my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Actually, for next research, I'm I am planning to pursue some of my interests in urban history and also the history of Hong Kong. So as I spent this time living in Hong Kong, I'm really interested to think about border relations and also the development of Shenzhen as a city. What got me into into museums was actually the preservation of sites and urban planning. So I'm hoping to pursue those interests in the next project. But your question is mostly about preserving oral histories. And I think that there are certain oral histories in China that have been more easy to do. One of the first steps in doing Cultural Revolution history in mainland China has been to do memories of sent-down youth, of Zhiqing. And so I think there are a lot of people who are collecting oral histories from Zhiqing and having Zhiqing write down their stories. I think that's much more politically correct than interviewing people who are persecuted. If those of you who are interested in the audience, there is a wonderful project by a librarian at the University of Pittsburgh called The Cultural Revolution in 10. So you can go on the website, and they've collected maybe around 200 oral histories where they ask people to talk about their memory of the Cultural Revolution for 10 minutes. And they are collecting these, and they also encourage people to interview people and send in your own contribution. So if you want to be part of that, you can look at their website. It's called The Cultural Revolution in 10 at the University of Pittsburgh. So if you wanted to interview somebody in China or outside of China, they're trying to do that project. And I think other people are doing similar kinds of work.
We've just been told that we have 5 minutes left, so the prize goes to this gentleman here.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for your introduction about how people collected and protected the Chinese relics in Shanghai Museum during the Mao period. And I wonder, do you have other stories about people's effort in preserving the intangible heritage like philosophy, Chinese drama, or traditional habits during the Mao period? Thank you.
That's a great question. The short answer is no. That's not something that I collected. I think sometimes people will come up to me and tell me stories about other kinds of intangible cultural heritage. I think that's a much more recent word. But things like calligraphy or music, sometimes people will tell me stories, but I haven't collected it in a systematic way. I think the word intangible cultural heritage is much more of a new term, probably coming from UNESCO. This designation of intangible cultural heritage as a global designation is new. In the socialist period, you really just had Wangwu, and then that was divided into movable and immovable cultural relics. So a painting or a vase or something, you can move it. So it was a movable cultural relic, and then 不可移动的文物 is things like temples or historic buildings. So intangible cultural heritage, I think, is something very new. But I think I can tell you where to look if you want to think about this category of intangible cultural heritage in the Mao period. And I think that's to look for those historians who work on religion. Because people who have been able to search local archives that have to do with religion will find that that many practices are allowed during the Mao period because they're labeled as culture. So there's someone who graduated from EALC at Harvard called Wang Xiaoxuan, and he looks at local religion and practices like, let's say, dragon boating or other kinds of local festivals, and finds that, in fact, local cadres may let people have them because they themselves are from the locality, and they find that these are people will protest or local people will actually use the words of the state and say, this is our culture, and therefore we should be allowed to continue these practices. Of course, these practices come and go. When you have very high political moments, those tend to disappear. But that's where I would look for the roots of intangible cultural heritage, histories of religion.
I think it's time to thank everyone for joining us today, and to, of course, thank our sponsors and supporters, and most of all, to thank Denise.
Thank you.